day, economics students, and welcome to another online video lecture. The focus of this particular online video lecture is the United States and the global economy. So we're going to tackle international economics. Let's begin our investigation of international trade by examining what we call the four international linkages. The first linkage between the United States, listed on the left-hand side, and all other countries, listed on the right-hand side, are what we call trade flows. You've heard these terms before: imports and exports. Ford Motor Company makes an automobile, produces an automobile in the United States, and the automobile is shipped over to England, purchased by a British person. That's a U.S. export. Someone working at Solomon Smith Barney offers financial advice or services to someone living in Germany. That's a U.S. export, right? And of course, Americans buy lots of goods and services from other countries. Those are imports. We will talk about the relationship between imports and exports in much more detail, but you get the idea for now: imports and exports, goods and services, trade flows. In addition to trading goods and services, there are also resource flows. So think of labor. That's the easiest one, right? An American takes a job working in Japan. So a good friend of mine took a job to work with Mellon Bank, Pittsburgh-based financial institution, worked in Tokyo for 3 years. That's an example of a labor flow from the United States to other countries. Now, we're only talking at the moment absolutely positively legal migration of labor, so we'll touch maybe on illegal immigration in another chapter, but for this chapter we're going to just stick to legal immigration. So the United States has a shortage of general practitioners, doctors. So we allow so many visas for doctors who are trained in other countries to come here and serve the medical needs of Americans, right? So labor flow from the United States to another country, in the example Japan. Maybe we have somebody who is trained as a doctor in Africa, comes here and works in good old Ohio, right? Resource flow. Well, you can think of one company that has a production facility in almost every country. Which company owns and operates a manufacturing facility in almost every country? You guessed it, the Golden Arches, McDonald's, right? So McDonald's sets up shop in almost every country. It would be silly to try to make quarter pounders in California and sell them to somebody in Calcutta, right? Instead, you just build a McDonald's in Calcutta, right? Other big companies such as Caterpillar have manufacturing facilities in places like China. That's a good example of a capital flow. Right? All of the major, well, I should say most of the major automobile producers, Subaru, Honda, Toyota, Mercedes, all have set up shop here in the United States. Example of capital flow in the other direction from another nation into the United States. So we got trade flows, we got resource flows, then we talk about information and technology flows. Information and technology about product prices, resource prices, technological know-how on how to produce goods and services, methodologies of production. And this is one of the sticking points if you've been following some of the news with the United States and China and some of the not so welcomed practices that the Chinese have been accused of in the international courts is, we'll say, circumventing the rules or downright ignoring the rules when it comes to respecting any type of intellectual property rights. So there are natural flows of information and technology, again, about product pricing, resource pricing, methodologies of producing goods and services, but each company in every country who has invented or patented those type of technologies should be compensated for their technologies. The last one is financial flows, right? Money makes the world go round, and we will talk about exchange rates. Right? How many dollars does a yen buy, or how many yen does a dollar buy? How many Chinese yuan does the US dollar buy? How many Australian dollars does a good old greenback buy? How many euros? And we'll talk about appreciation and depreciation of the dollar, and how appreciation or depreciation, strengthening and weakening of the dollar, ultimately affects international trade. Some trade patterns real quick. Assume everyone already knows this, but probably good to review just to make sure. Imports, goods and services purchased from foreign sources, all right, produced by a company operating somewhere else on the globe outside the United States. Exports, goods and services produced here in the United States and sold to foreign buyers. So you remember from the beginning of the course, one of the 8 economic goals is balance of trade, right? So when you think about what could happen, let's use simple numbers so you can picture this in your mind. Assume the United States imported $1 trillion worth of goods and services, and at the same time that year exported $1 trillion worth of goods and services. We would have a trade balance. That is to say, imports, dollar value of, and dollar value of exports were equal. But that's not likely to happen. It's not likely to happen. For every year since 1973 or 4, the United States has had what's called a trade deficit. That is to say, the dollar value of imports exceeds exports. Right? Dollar value of imports exceeds exports. There is a possibility that U.S. exports could exceed imports and we would have a trade surplus. Right? Now, an important idea here is the idea of how do we account for the imbalance. In other words, think of it in these terms, right? No such thing as a free lunch. We can't just import more than we export and expect the rest of the world to just be happy with this. So when we have an imbalance, that is to say, if imports exceed exports, we have to finance the trade deficit. We have to finance the trade deficit. So how is that possible? Well, there's one of 2 ways for us to finance the trade deficit. So either we could sell off real American assets. So in other words, foreigners buy things like, I don't know, condos in Miami or golf course in California, right? Or we borrow money. And the United States is the world's largest debtor, D-E-B-T-O-R, debtor nation, right? The world's largest debtor nation. So we can't have a trade deficit without sort of paying for it, right? So trade deficit must be offset, and the way we offset is either selling off real American assets or through borrowing. Now, last year, the trade deficit was approximately, and this is the year 2019, $617 billion. All right, as a matter of fact, it's been right around the $600 billion mark for a little while now. The trade deficit actually dropped by 1.7% last year. Okay, let's talk about some of these ideas related to trade. All right, first, volume. After World War II, the United States was the absolute leader as far as volume of trade and as far as percentage of world trade. Between 1950 and say 1970, the United States represented something like 40% of all trade. As far as our total contribution to world trade, it's actually declined as far as the total contribution to world trade. But as a percentage of U.S. GDP and as in dollar terms, it's actually increased. So, in other words, there's many more participants in world trade than there was in the years between 1950 and 1970, right? So, in volume terms, the United States, and we will see this on a chart in a slide or two, dollar value of imports and dollar value of exports has risen quite substantially over the last 40 years. Additionally, as a percentage of our economic output, trade has become more important. Now, the idea of dependence, that can have 2 connotations. One, it can mean how dependent is a country on exports for its economic well-being? What percentage of the country's total economy is exported? Well, since we're thinking about this particular issue at the time, you should ask yourself, of the $20 trillion U.S. economy, what percentage of our economy is exported? Turns out it's roughly 12%, 12 or 13%. Okay, but we're going to see there's other countries where greater than 70% of their economic output is exported to another country. The other economic meaning behind dependence is what do you depend on other countries for? The United States doesn't grow bananas. The United States doesn't grow much coffee, right? So if we want coffee and we want bananas, we have to import it. Right? Trade pattern. We will see this shortly, but it turns out most of our trade is with other industrialized countries. Most of our trade is with other industrialized countries. We will talk at length later in the chapter about the financial linkages and exchange rates and how exchange rates makes this all possible. Okay, so this is exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP. All right, exports of goods and services as a percentage of total economic output for the nation. So if you look at this, you're like, wow, look at Belgium. 91% of what they produce is sold to people outside of Belgium. All right, Germany exports roughly half their economic output. Canada, 35% of their economic output. The UK, 25% of their economic output. The United States, only 12% of our economic output. 12% of our GDP is exported. But don't be fooled by numbers. In absolute dollar terms, the United States exports more goods and services than anyone on this list. Germany is a little bit closer than most, but the United States is the world's second largest exporter behind China, and it's pretty close as far as the numbers. So this figure from the textbook helps us understand how trade has changed over time from 1975 through 2015 and how imports and exports have grown in importance relative to our economic output. So on the horizontal axis, measuring time, simple, 1975 through 2015. On the vertical axis, we're measuring both imports and exports as a percentage of our nation's total economic output, GDP, gross domestic product. All right. So again, we're measuring imports, goods and services we purchase from firms in other countries, right, made in other countries, and exports, goods and services produced here in the United States and sold to people in other nations as a percentage of our economic output, right? Now it shows you in billions of dollars that in 1975 exports were 245 billion and imports were 252 billion. And then how much they've grown by 2012, right? 1838 as far as exports, it's 1838 billion. Imports all the way up to 2238, right? Now, what else do you notice as far as the relationship between imports and exports over time? Well, red line are our exports. The red wavy lines are exports. The blue line is our imports. So the distance between those two represents the trade deficit, right? Also notice that at several points in this historical picture, the two lines converge. In 1982, 1991, and then again near 2007. Interestingly enough, that during economic downturns or recessions, the trade deficit narrows mostly because Americans stop purchasing large ticket items, luxury products produced in other nations. So this graph is important to show us how trade has grown in importance as part of our economy over time. So what do we have here? Selected principal U.S. exports and import in goods. Now this is the year 2012, although that's a little antiquated because we're in the year 2020. The names or the products themselves, they're not going to change much. But here's what's interesting when you look left side, right side, right? So energy products, petroleum, number one on both lists, right? Import and export. Look at metals, import and export. Look at, automobiles on what? Both lists, right? Look at chemicals on both lists. Look at pharmaceuticals on both lists. Look at general equipment on both lists. It's interesting that we import and export many of the same goods. What is that telling us? That we import and export many of the same products. Well, one is that simply we like choices, right? The other is that, as we said earlier, most of our trade is with other modern industrialized nations, right? So this is 2012. The numbers have changed, but the pattern remains pretty much the same. This is imports and exports in dollar terms with other nations, with other countries. So notice that in 2012, Canada was our most significant trading partner. Right? Our exports to Canada, 294 billion, 19% of our exports. Imports, 329 billion, and 14% of our imports were from Canada. Right? Um, it's interesting when you look at these numbers as far as China. Even in 2012, we had a pretty significant trade deficit with China. In 2012, it was 427 minus 112, right? So 412 minus 112 would be $315 billion trade deficit with China in 2012. So this is interesting. It's also interesting to look at the EU, European Union, as one entity. So this gives you some information on who are we trading with. What is the significance of our trade with specific countries. All right, some more recent data, 2016. This shows us our trade deficit or surplus with certain products. So in 2016, the largest part of our deficit was autos, engines, and parts to the tune of $192 billion. Clothing, $94 billion, $80 billion worth of crude and fuel oil, which is interesting because of the fracking and directional drilling. We're less dependent on foreign countries for our energy sources. $73 billion in cell phones and other household goods, almost $70 billion in computers and accessories, $58 billion in pharmaceutical drugs, which is interesting because we make a lot of pharmaceuticals here. But if you look at the world's largest generic drug maker, Teva, that company exists in Israel. All right. Telecommunications equipment deficit about $31 billion. Toys, games, and sporting goods about $26 billion worth of deficit. Televisions and video almost $20 billion worth of deficit. Now, where are we crushing it as far as exports? Aircraft and engines, soys, chemicals, and newsprint are our goods. Although that soy export in 2016, this number is last year, 2019, our soy exports were crushed because of the trade war we've had with China. We're hoping that our poor farmers can reestablish relationships with China now that we've entered phase one deal with China as far as coming to some agreement on trade. Right? What else do we export? Our services, travel and tourism, intellectual properties, and financial services are our big service exports. So this is good because it's real pertinent information from an excellent source. All right, so when you think about trade, what's changed the game? Well, some of these are just common sense. Transportation has been blown up in the last 30 years. Communication, you can communicate with anybody on the planet instantly. But the big one here is the general decline in tariffs. It is quite, we'll say, a particularly interesting time to discuss how the general decline in tariffs created a significant boom in trade from, say, 1980 through the 2016. But now we've had more use of tariffs in the last several years of, well, 3 years into Trump's presidency than ever before. Whether that's a good policy or bad policy depends on your point of view. Most likely Donald Trump was warranted in accusing China of circumventing World Trade Organization rules or just downright ignoring them, right? The other reason why trade has grown so much is because of multinational corporations. Big giant corporations who own and operate manufacturing or production facilities in more than one company and produce more than one good or service. All right, why do nations trade? According to an economist, it is all based on these two ideas, more so the latter, absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is an idea introduced by Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, 1776. Comparative advantage was an idea introduced by David Ricardo sometime later, and David Ricardo actually pointed out that Adam Smith made a mistake when it came to his logic on trade. So absolute advantage simply means that given roughly the same amount of resources, a nation can produce more than its potential trading partner. That's what absolute advantage means. Comparative advantage is the one that's way more interesting and a little more challenging for students to grasp. Comparative advantage means that a nation can produce a product at a lower domestic opportunity cost than its potential trading partner. All of our rationale and any of our economic arguments to support, advocate for trade are going to be framed using this idea of comparative advantage. We look at the comparative cost of producing one product in a certain country versus another country, and we say, wow, If you can produce a product at a lower domestic opportunity cost than a potential trading partner, you should concentrate, specialize your limited or scarce resources in producing that product and trade for other products. So comparative advantage is a huge economic principle. We will go with some mathematical examples so you have a better understanding of what we mean by comparative advantage as the rationale or the basis for trade. Right? So we'll discuss in detail this idea of comparative costs. After we've identified which nation has a comparative advantage based on comparative costs, then we'll talk about the idea of, okay, assume each nation will agree to focus on producing a product in which it enjoys a comparative advantage, take its limited or scarce land, capital, or labor, its limited resources, concentrate its economic efforts in producing a product in which it possesses a comparative advantage, specialize, and trade for the other product. We will also discuss the idea of terms of trade. In other words, if I'm sending you product X and you're sending me product Y, how many X's do I get for Y's? So again, Adam Smith introduced the economic idea or principle known as absolute advantage in his book, Wealth of Nations. David Ricardo, who was a mathematical genius, comes along some half century later and points out, man, Adam, you made a little faux pas, a little mistake, that the basis for trade is not determined by if a nation can produce more than its potential trading partner, absolute advantage. It's completely determined what's called comparative advantage. So Ricardo uses this idea of comparative advantage to explain the potential benefits of specializing your economic production in producing a product in which you have the lowest comparative cost or domestic opportunity cost. Now, we already covered this idea way back when, the idea of opportunity cost, right? What you must give up, the next best alternative, right? Whatever you forego. There's always a cost. So think of it in these terms, right? If we could calculate, if we could measure opportunity cost, in other words, every time we want more of X, how many Y do we have to give up? What stands to reason that if my country has to give up less to produce Y, if I'm producing X, I have to give up less of Y than you would. That I stand to gain by concentrating my limited or scarce resources in producing the product in which I have a comparative advantage. Now, here's the real brilliance of David Ricardo. All right, we'll see the math in a moment, but not only did he identify the economic rationale behind trade and prove it mathematically, he also demonstrated time and again that even if a nation has an absolute advantage in producing all products, it still stands to benefit by concentrating its limited or scarce resource in producing a product in which it has a comparative advantage. And it's mathematically impossible for a nation to have a comparative advantage in producing all products. And that was David Ricardo's huge contribution to economic thinking. The idea that even if a nation produced an absolute advantage in producing all products, it was mathematically impossible to have a comparative advantage in producing all products, and therefore it still made sense to concentrate your limited or scarce resources, specialize, and trade. So, why do nations trade, right? What is the definition of economics? Limited economic resources, right? Limited land, capital, labor, entrepreneurs, unlimited economic wants. All right, we understand that. Theoretically, the reason why trade is beneficial to humans, it lessens the burden of scarcity, right? We talked about the idea of scarcity. Limited or scarce resources forces us to make choice. Every time we make a choice, there's a cost involved. And think of it in terms of our production possibility frontier, right? If we could produce beyond our production possibility limits, our nation would be made better off, but we said any point outside the curve was desirable but unattainable. Right? Economic theory suggests that specialization in trade allows a nation to escape the limitations of its domestic production possibility frontier. That is to say, consume more than it otherwise could. And in simple economic terms and everyday life terms, it means it improves the standard of living of people in both countries. So that's the idea, right? Lessens the burden of scarcity, improves the standard of living of people living in both nations. Okay, we already went over this, but it's good to Review real quick. Absolute advantage means an economy can produce more than another country, all right, with roughly the same number of resources. The more important one, comparative advantage. A nation or an economy can produce a product at a lower domestic opportunity cost than its potential trading partner. Let's use an example, and this will become much more clear. All right, we have two nations. One's called the Crew and one's called the Islanders. Assume for a moment that the Crew only make two products and that they don't even know that the potential of another trading partner exists. So here's the Crew's production possibility frontier, and for simplicity, they're just making two products, huts on the vertical axis and radios on the horizontal axis. Remember, production possibility frontier demonstrates absolute limitations of production. So if this production possibility frontier were to represent 1 month's worth of potential production for the Crew, this little nation, the best they could ever make was 120 huts, right? See, that's what the limitations of hut production on the vertical axis. Likewise, the most radios they could ever make is 20, just inside 21 there on the horizontal axis. So huts on the vertical, radios on the horizontal. Right now, you also remember that they're probably going to want some of both. So here's the thing: they can't have more huts without giving up radios. They can't have any more radios without giving up huts. Using marginal benefits and marginal cost, right? They would eventually settle on some combination of huts and radios, which maximizes their happiness. We call that perfect mix of output allocative efficiency. Right? Now, for you to go further, it's really important for you to understand where we're getting these numbers. On the screen, it tells you the opportunity cost of a radio and a hut for this country. It says the opportunity cost of making a radio is 6 huts, and the opportunity cost of making a hut is 1/6 of a radio. Well, here's the unfortunate problem. What if you're given this question on a test or a quiz and the answers are in front of you? Well, it's going to be more challenging. But the math here is simple. And the math is simple because of one distinguishing factor of our study of trade. Notice the shape of the production possibility frontier. It is linear. It's straight. If you remember back to chapter 2, when we studied production possibility frontier, what does a linear production possibility frontier tell us? If a production possibility frontier is curved, it means what? Constant costs along the curve, which is a fancy way of saying what? Every time this country wants more huts, they have to give up the same number of radios. And vice versa, every time they want more radios, they have to give up the same number of huts. Therefore, calculating the opportunity cost is simple. All right, think of it like this. What if the nation was taking all of its land, capital, and labor, all of its economic resources, and it was just making huts, 120? That's the most they could ever make with their limited or scarce resources. Say, yeah, well, we don't like huts anymore. Now we want to make radios. Well, let's turn around and take all of our economic resources, land, capital, and labor. Let's put all of our economic efforts into making radios. How many could we make? 20. 20 is the most we could ever make. So we had to give up 120 huts to get those 20 radios. 120 on the numerator, 20 on the denominator. 120 divided by 20 is 6. Therefore, each radio cost 6 huts. The opportunity cost of a radio is 6 huts. To get the opportunity cost of a hut, you simply invert the fraction. If we were just making radios, 20 of them, because that's the most we can make with our limited or scarce resources, and we gave them all up, that's in our numerator, to get 120 huts, that's in our denominator, 20 over 120, whatever you're getting, put that on the bottom of your fraction. The opportunity cost of a hut is 1/6 of a radio. It's important to understand where we're getting those numbers, because if you don't understand that, you're going to have trouble understanding the idea of specialization in trade based on comparative costs. All right, one more time in simple English. The opportunity cost of a radio for the Crew is 6 huts. Every time they want another radio, they have to give up 6 huts. The opportunity cost of a hut is 1/6 of a radio. If they want another hut, they have to give up 1/6 of a radio. Now, I know somebody might be thinking, well, what the heck is a fraction of a radio? In the real world, there'd be millions of these, and it wouldn't be talking about an actual fraction of a product. All right, let's look at a potential trading partner of the Crew. Here's the Islanders. Similar situation. They haven't considered trade because terms of trade, right? The rate at which one good is exchanged for another. So if you're the crew, say, okay, we're making radios, we want some huts back. For the islanders, we agree to make huts based on our comparative costs. We want some radios back, right? So how many A you get for B, or how many B you get for A. Think about how the terms of trade must work out. We call this limits to the terms of trade. You're not going to make yourself worse off through trade. So if you're the crew, you said, okay, every time I wanted another radio, I had to give up 6 huts. I better get at least 6 huts in return, or this whole deal's no good for me. The islanders are going to use the same logic. Every time I wanted a hut, I had to give up 1/9 of a radio. If I'm not getting at least 1/9 in return, I'm making myself worse off. I'd never do that. So what's the fancy way of saying that? The terms of trade must lie between what? The respective opportunity costs of each country's production. All right, what does that mean? Say, okay, we're the crew. We're going to make radios. The opportunity cost of a radio is 6 huts. If we get 6.1, 6.2, 6.8, 7, right, we're happy. Right? As long as we're getting more than we were before, we're made better off. The islanders, all right, well, the opportunity cost of a hut, 1/9 of a radio. If we're getting anything better than 1/9, we're happy as well. Again, the terms of trade between two nations must lie somewhere between the respective opportunity cost of production. All right, just common sense. So here is the magic of trade. Why do nations trade? Look at the new point of consumption for the crew. The crew now consumes this much. Now, we just made this point up just to prove a point, haha, right? Prior to trade, the crew could never consume beyond its production possibility frontier. They had to settle for some point along the curve. But now they can consume at a point beyond their curve. They're made better off, right? Lessens the burden of scarcity, increases their standard of living. Now, the islanders, same thing for them. They actually escape their limitations as well, right? So, theoretically, specialization in trade benefits all people. If a nation takes its limited or scarce resources and produces a product in which it possesses a comparative advantage based on this economic theory or principle, both nations should be made better off because both nations are now consuming beyond their domestic limitations of production. Standard of living increases, lessens the burden of scarcity. Let's examine another example to reinforce the ideas of absolute advantage, comparative advantage, specialization, trade, and gains from trade. Here we have two nations, Belgium and Canada, and we are considering the production of two products. On the vertical axis, DVDs, on the horizontal axis, tractors. Notice we've constructed both nations' production possibility frontier on the same graph. This is actually a really solid piece of advice if you're ever given a production possibilities problem to analyze on a test or quiz. Drawing the picture makes certain economic ideas evident and almost unmistakable. Belgium's production possibility frontier is the blackish, bluish, darker production possibility curve. Canada is the red production possibility frontier, right? So if you look at, let's assume this is per month. This graph represents production possibility frontier of these two products per month for both of these countries in question. If we look at potential production of DVDs, notice Belgium's production possibility frontier lies outside that of Canada. Therefore, Belgium has an absolute advantage in producing DVDs. Likewise, Belgium's production possibility frontier lies further outside of the Canadian production of tractors. Belgium can make more tractors. In economic terms, Belgium has the absolute advantage in producing both DVDs and tractors. Right? Now, the interesting thing about drawing both of these on the same graph and the economic benefit of such an analysis is that you don't even need numbers to come to that conclusion. Likewise, if you take a closer look at this particular graph, you can determine Which country has the comparative advantage in producing both products? Look at tractor production. Notice that Belgium is dwarfing Canadian tractor production, right? They're better at producing DVDs. In other words, they can produce more, but Canada is not so far behind in producing DVDs. Now, what does that observation tell us about the economics? It means that Belgium not only has the absolute advantage of producing DVDs and tractors, Belgium's going to enjoy the comparative advantage in producing tractors. But remember the magic and the genius of David Ricardo. It's impossible for a nation to have a comparative advantage of producing both products. Look at DVD production. Yes, Canada is behind the Belgian production of DVDs, but they're not as far behind as they are on tractors percentage-wise. So really bad English, really good economics. Belgium's more better at tractors. Canada is less worse at DVDs. Therefore, both of these countries should specialize in producing the product in which they enjoy the comparative advantage. Now, on the board, it also tells you mathematically the same exact conclusion. This slide shows you numerically the opportunity cost of each product in question. Every time Belgium wants another tractor, they must give up 3 DVDs. How did we get that number? Well, we could start at all tractor production, 60, and assume we would give up all of our tractors to get DVDs, 20. 60 over 20, each tractor cost 3 DVDs, right? Inverting the fraction, the opportunity cost of a DVD in Belgium is 1/3 of a tractor, 20 over 60. Remember, important idea, we assume constant costs along the curve. This is an introductory economics course. If you took an international finance class, you would later on relax that assumption, but for the time being, the straight or the linear production possibility frontier tells us that there are constant costs along the curve. Each time Belgium wants another tractor, they have to give up exactly 3 DVDs. And if Belgium wants more DVDs, they have to give up 1/3 of a tractor to get the next DVD. Employing the same mathematical approach to calculate the Canadian opportunity cost, the opportunity cost of making a tractor in Canada is 4.5 DVDs, right? Now, it's hard to see this, the numbers on the next slide. I will tell you the numbers, right? But how do we calculate the Canadian 4.5 and 2/9, right? I'll show you using the numbers on the next slide how we came up with those opportunity costs, but for now, trust me, those are correct. The opportunity cost of making a tractor in Canada is 4.5 DVDs. That is to say, Canada has to give up more DVDs per tractor than Belgium. Once again, we prove mathematically that Belgium has the comparative advantage in making tractors. They should make tractors and trade for DVDs. Likewise, the opportunity cost of making a DVD in Canada is less than it is in Belgium. 2/9 of a tractor. The opportunity cost of a DVD in Canada is 2/9 of a tractor. It's 3/9 or 1/3 in Canada. So we've already decided which nation has, or determined I should say, which nation has an absolute advantage in producing both products, a comparative advantage in producing both products, and therefore which nation should specialize in producing each product and trade for the other product. Canada should make DVDs, Belgium should make tractors, and the two nations should trade. They still have to figure out terms of trade. Here are the numbers from which the production possibility frontiers were constructed. So notice Canada's production possibility frontier. I told you we would explain where the numbers came from, right? So if you're at point A on the Canadian production possibility frontier, making 0 tractors and 54 DVDs, and you were to give up all 54 DVDs to get 12 tractors all the way over to point G as in good, right? 54 over 12 works out to be 4.5 or 4.5, right? 4.5. The opportunity cost of a tractor for Canada is 4.5 DVDs. Now, because the production possibility frontier is linear, you could pick any 2 points to come up with that same conclusion. So for instance, again, analyzing Canada's production possibility frontier, starting at point A and just moving to point B. At point A, there are no tractors being produced, 54 DVDs. At point B, as in boy, 2 tractors have been produced, but it cost 9 DVDs because DVD production fell from 54 to 45. 9 over 2 is 4.5. In other words, to get those 2 tractors, Canada had to give up 9 DVDs, so each tractor cost 4.5 DVDs. Right? Now, get comfortable with calculating opportunity costs for each product. As soon as you're comfortable with that process, you're pretty much in the driver's seat when it comes to determining specialization, trade, and then of course gains from trade. So let's look a little further at the numbers in this problem than we did with the Crew and the Islanders. In the Crew and the Islanders, we identified which nation had a comparative advantage in producing each product. We also identified what the maximum production of each product would be, and then we discussed the idea that each nation would benefit from trade by consuming beyond its domestic limitations prior to trade. The following information would have to be given to you in the problem. Later on in this slide presentation, it tells you that Canada was allocatively efficient at point D as in dog, that is 6 tractors and 27 DVDs. Belgium likewise is allocatively efficient at G as in good, 12 tractors and 24 DVDs. Why would that information have to be given to you? Here's the reason. Remember, allocative efficiency is a normative decision. Given the same level of resources and the same geopolitical structure within a nation, 2 countries could pick vastly different points on their curves as allocatively efficient. It's the mix of output which maximizes the happiness, satisfaction, utility for the citizens within that country. For whatever reason, maybe Canadians value tractors more than DVDs or vice versa. Same thing with Belgium, but it's a normative decision. It is subjective by nature. Where a nation is allocatively efficient prior to trade needs to be given in the problem. You could never just randomly select that point. However, once you're given that information, you can then calculate the benefits from trade. So, quick review. Belgium has the absolute advantage of producing tractors. They can produce 20 at point K on their curve. Canada can only produce 12. Belgium also has the absolute advantage of producing both products. Belgium can produce 60 at point A on their curve. Canada can only produce 54 at point A on their curve. What about comparative advantage? Right? According to Adam Smith, there's no reason to trade because Belgium has absolute advantage of producing both products. David Ricardo comes along and points out that Adam Smith made a huge mistake. David Ricardo says it still makes sense to take your limited or scarce resources and produce the product for which you have a comparative advantage, a lower domestic opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of a tractor in Belgium is 3 DVDs. In Canada, the opportunity cost of a tractor is 4.5 DVDs. Lower domestic opportunity cost for Belgium, comparative advantage for Belgium. Belgium should concentrate its limited land, capital, and labor and entrepreneur ability into making tractors and trade for DVDs. Opportunity cost for Canada for a DVD, 2/9 of a tractor, which is lower than 1/3 in Belgium. Right? Canada has a lower domestic opportunity cost in producing DVDs. Canada should specialize in making DVDs and trade for tractors. Okay, now that we know that information, what will be the output of each product? Right? Well, Canada will choose to produce at point A. They'll just make DVDs. They won't make tractors anymore, which means they will make 54. Belgium will choose the opposite. They'll just make tractors. They'll make 20. So now that we've established which nation will specialize in producing each product based on comparative costs after calculating opportunity cost of each product, we can now calculate the gains from trade. So here's what we do. We add up total production of both tractors and DVDs prior to trade, and then we add up production of both products after trade. So prior to trade, how many tractors were being made? Well, Belgium made 12 because they were happy at point G as in good on their curve. Canada made 6, point D on their curve. 12 plus 6 is 18. right? Canada made 6, F point D as in dog. Belgium made 12, F point G as in good. 12 plus 6 is 18. But look, now the nations are producing 20 tractors, right? So tractor production went up by 2 units. Who gets the extra tractors? Could be 1 each, could be 2 for Canada, right? How about DVD production? Prior to trade, Belgium made 24, point D on their curve. Canada made 27. 27 plus 24 is 51. 54 being produced now. Right, Canada is making 54. 54 minus 51, production of DVDs went up by 3 units. Right? Again, Canada might get 2 extras and Belgium 1 extra, or vice versa. Right? In the real world, these would be in the millions. Now, one last important idea. Terms of trade. We went over this earlier, but terms of trade mean that each country will only participate in trade if they're made better off. So for Belgium, each time they wanted a tractor, they had to give up 3 DVDs. As long as they're getting better than 3 DVDs every time they trade a tractor, they're happy. Right? Canada making DVDs and trading for tractors, every time they made a DVD, they had to give up 2/9 of a tractor. As long as they're getting better than that 2/9 in trade, they're happy. The terms of trade must lie beneath the respective opportunity cost of production for each country. So, again, why do most economists advocate trade? We demonstrated mathematically that through specialization in trade, both nations are made better off and now consume at a point beyond their domestic limitations. So, if specialization and trade allows nations to consume beyond their domestic limitations, why are there ever any type of protest against trade? Well, think about the previous example. Assume you lived in Canada and you worked at the tractor factory from the time you were 18 until you were 32. So you put in a solid 14 years and you were just about to make manager. And all of a sudden, international trade changes the economics and your factory closes because less expensive imports are available. Likewise, if you were in the technology industry and you worked in the producing of DVDs in Belgium, your job may be lost because of international trade. So economists refer to this concept as macroeconomic winners, microeconomic losers. Now remember, this is a positive, not normative statement. Obviously not judging anyone. We're just trying to make sense of trade patterns, trade flows, and the unintended consequences. So there's no doubt that specialization in trade raises the standard of living from the standpoint of more consumption for all individuals living in a nation. However, the gains are spread out among millions of people, and the pain is concentrated typically in specific industries or specific sectors, which oftentimes gives governments reason to raise the case for protection. In other words, to come up with some argument against allowing the natural forces of supply and demand and international economics to dictate what happens as far as specialization in trade. So free trade, but with some heavy-handed government involvement, so to speak. One argument against allowing absolute free trade is called military self-sufficiency. And the argument goes something like this. If a certain country, let's assume the United States, allows another company in a foreign country to produce a certain product, or even for us to become reliant on that nation for a certain resource, what happens if push comes to shove and there's a military conflict and it escalates and we can no longer access that product or resource? The argument suggests we shouldn't allow production of that particular good or service or resource into the nation based on the idea of military self-sufficiency. That we have to be ready, willing, and able to produce that specific product, resource, or service all the time on our own, because it would be a danger to the nation's safety and well-being if there was a conflict and we can no longer ramp up production. Most economists believe this is a rather weak argument for two reasons. Number one, many of the goods, services, and resources we source are from our allies. So through good times and bad times, rough times and peaceful times, we typically have access to those resources. Likewise, the United States is a pretty large country and has been pretty blessed with natural resources. Look at what happened at the end of the Great Depression into World War II. The economic marvel of ramping up production of guns and tanks and bombs and planes was nothing beyond spectacular. So, if necessary, we could ramp up production of military output pretty quickly. Another argument against allowing the natural forces of specialization in trade to dictate what products are imported or exported is diversification for stability. The United Arab Emirates has realized that black gold, Texas tea, oil will not be the economic marvel of the next century, right? It won't be the input of choice, the resource of energy production. So they've decided that they should take measures to diversify their economy, not to have all of their economic eggs in one basket. And this makes a great deal of sense to some extent, right? It makes a great deal of sense to some extent when you think, wow, what if 80% of our economic output is related to the oil industry and the global demand for oil drops quickly because of alternative sources or some scientific development? So diversification for stability makes a lot of sense. Infant industry. If you remember the idea of economies of scale, when you think about large-scale manufacturing such as automobile manufacturing, it's nearly impossible for a country or a company within a nation to ramp up production to the level that's necessary to achieve a average total cost per unit low enough to compete, right? So if you think about Ford, GM, Chrysler, they've made massive $1 billion investments in capital, in equipment, factories, and plants. And this capital investment reaps benefits because the companies can produce automobiles at a pretty low average total cost per unit. If you were to start an automobile company, it would be nearly impossible to grow large enough to compete with those types of companies globally. So South Korea decided to give their automobile industry a kickstart, a head start, a helping hand. Hyundai and Kia did not exist 20 years ago, or were not household names. South Korea realized if the automobile industry were to ever take off in their country, they needed infant industry production. In other words, the government had to build a plant and get them up and running. One question about this type of behavior is, how long do you subsidize an industry? How long is an infant industry? All right, lately you may have heard the term dumping, protection against dumping. Dumping has two different meanings when it comes to international trade and economics. Dumping could simply mean selling a product in a foreign country for less than what you sell it in your domestic market after considering exchange rates. That's usually not the type of dumping where a nation has the WTO up its back about misbehavior. The second definition or connotation of dumping refers to selling a product for less than it costs to produce. Now, if you think about this, it doesn't make sense to use that as your business model. All right, let's use the example of televisions. If it costs us $200 to make a TV, we're not going to be in business very long if we sell every unit for $194. However, it's going to be difficult on competition, especially in foreign markets, if we're undercutting them on price. So this is why people in Ohio were extremely upset with the Chinese practice of subsidizing electronic manufacturers. China realized that, yeah, we'll have these state-run organizations introduce electronics products in the United States, sell them for a loss for a period of time, have the government subsidize their losses, and over the course of 3 to 5 years, put American producers out of business. So one of the arguments against international trade is say, look, we can't have this where we're allowing a foreign company being subsidized by its government to sell products in our backyard here when our domestic producers aren't really on level playing ground. Right? They're not being compensated or subsidized by the U.S. government. So that's a legitimate argument. The last two kind of go hand in hand: increased domestic employment and cheap foreign labor. Right? One argument is simply that we just need to have more people working here in the United States, and we can't shift jobs outside of the country. The other idea is that, well, it's not really fair for Americans to attempt to compete in certain industries when you look at 1 billion people or more living in India or China, and therefore the cheap labor advantage requires us to take some form of protection against trade with that nation. So, what type of trade barriers do nations erect to thwart or alter the natural course of international trade? All right, tariffs. It's funny. Tariffs used to be, in economic terms, a dirty word. It was paramount to say anybody, any country that levied tariffs was really kind of frowned upon because it was an antiquated approach. Matter of fact, started teaching economics. One of the major drivers of growth in international trade over the last 20 or 30 years had been the serious reduction in tariffs among all members of the World Trade Organization. Lately, tariffs have become common vernacular. Seems like every country's been discussing them ever since Trump got elected. But tariffs in economic terms are simply a tax. Right? So, if you're going to sell automobiles in this country, well, we're going to levy a tax on each car you sell, and therefore the import will appear more expensive than the domestically produced vehicle. Most economists believe that the tariffs are a bad idea. Now, whether or not Trump should hold China accountable, that's a really interesting issue at the time because both Democrats and Republicans not exactly happy with China's either circumventing or downright ignoring World Trade Organization rules, especially when it comes to intellectual property and such. So, for the moment, tariffs might be a necessary evil in our trade, let's say, negotiations with a country like China. In the past, tariffs seemed to be just a way to raise prices for consumers. For instance, in the 70s, when the big four at that point, Ford, GM, Chrysler, and American Motor Company, were getting crushed by inexpensive, high-quality, fuel-efficient Japanese imports, they begged the government to slap tariffs on these Japanese imports. The government agreed, which made the price of Japanese cars higher, but American manufacturers responded by simply increasing their prices of their cars, and the loser was the American consumer. All right, non-tariff barriers, NTBs. Fancy way of saying what? Red tape. Making it challenging to get licensing or difficult to import a product based on some rule or some local jurisdiction that doesn't allow for such and such to happen. A good example of this is the European Union and their refusal to allow some agricultural products produced in the United States to be imported into Europe because of certain fertilizers that American growers use when cultivating the plants. Now, I know there are some concerns about GMO and such, but Americans have been consuming vegetables and fruits with certain fertilizers used to cultivate their growth for the past 40 years, and Europe simply says they're unsafe because they don't want domestic farmers to have to compete with international uh, trade, and for their domestic producers of fruits and vegetables to be undercut by American exports. Another interesting approach is voluntary export restriction. Japanese automobile manufacturers and the Japanese government, even with electronics in the 70s and early 80s, agreed to VERs, or voluntary export restrictions, because they looked and saw that the landscape of the American economy and said, look, 1 out of every 18 U.S. jobs is either directly or indirectly tied to the automobile industry, right? We don't want to crush the entire industry, because then there will be no consumer left to buy our car. So they understood, like, let's let good be good enough and not flood the market with a number of cars that would be seriously detrimental to the American producers. Right. Another approach that governments take to protect domestic producers is they subsidize domestic producers. And we talked about that with China subsidizing their producers of certain goods, and how that makes it unfair for domestic producers of goods and services. Okay, let's re-examine one more time the idea of absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and then more importantly, gains from trade. So quickly, you can look at these two nations. On the left-hand side, you have the United States. On the right-hand side, you have Brazil. Right? On the vertical axis, you have coffee. On the horizontal axis, you have wheat. Right? It even shows you which point on each curve was allocatively efficient prior to trade. But quickly answer these questions, right? Which nation has an absolute advantage in producing coffee? Obviously, the United States. 30 tons versus 20 tons. Which nation has an absolute advantage in producing wheat? Again, the United States, 30 tons versus 10 tons. Now, where does the United States dominate more? In wheat or in coffee? Well, the United States can triple the output of wheat production. All right. Brazil's not quite as bad at coffee. All right, they can produce 2/3 the level of our coffee production. So you also know that, just looking at the graphs here, that the United States should concentrate its limited or scarce resources in producing wheat and trade for coffee. All right. Brazil, on the other hand, they should make just coffee and trade for wheat. Now think about this, right? Each nation was limited to consuming somewhere along its curve prior to trade. On this example, it actually shows you the point. All right. The USA was consuming at point A on its production possibility frontier. Right? Brazil was producing at point B on its production possibility frontier. Both nations would be happy to consume at any level of output beyond the respective choice today of allocative efficiency, right? Without trade, America can never consume beyond its limitations, beyond its production possibility frontier. Right? Point A is one choice, I mean there's a limitless number of choices, but they can never consume beyond the red production possibility curve. Likewise, Brazil was limited to consuming on its curve as well. Now that we've reviewed the idea of absolute and comparative advantage and identified which nation should produce which product based on comparative costs, let's introduce a new idea called the trading possibility line, right? If you look at the blue line, right, the United States would be happy to consume anywhere beyond its previous limitations, right? Likewise, Brazil would be happy to consume anywhere beyond its previous limitations. So we look and say, okay, the United States will accept anything greater than the current opportunity cost of coffee for the wheat it makes. And likewise, Brazil will be happy to accept anything, any level of wheat beyond the opportunity cost of coffee. So we just simply fill in these gaps here, and we notice the yellow area all represents the potential gains from trade. And it shows you on this graph that after trade, right, remember, the United States made wheat based on comparative advantage. Brazil made coffee. Both nations specialized. They didn't discover more land or capital or labor, right? There's no new methodology of producing products or services. Simply through specialization in trade, each nation now consumed beyond its previous limitations, right? The trading possibility shows you the potential gains from trade, lessening the burden of scarcity, increasing consumption beyond the limitations of your previous domestic profitability frontier. The United States consumes at A prime, and Brazil consumes at B prime. Both points, A prime and B prime, used to be called desirable but unattainable, outside the limitations of the production possibility frontier. That's the magic of trade. Let's extend our market analysis and the tools of supply and demand to understand how prices of goods or services are determined in world or in global price markets, right? So analysis is what we call exports and imports, supply and demand analysis, that is, right? We're talking about the amount of goods and services will export or import depends on the differences between equilibrium world price and equilibrium domestic price. Well, let's skip world price for a moment. Let's talk about domestic price. That one's simple. The market forces of buyers and sellers determines the price and quantity equilibrium in the market, right? This is stuff we covered way back when in the beginning of this course, and we understand that buyers trying to maximize utility, sellers trying to maximize profits will ultimately lead us to equilibrium in the market, price and quantity. Okay, that one's easy enough. But how about the world price? Well, that's going to equate the quantity, supply, and demand globally. Let's provide an example to demonstrate how world prices are determined. Okay, this is the market for aluminum, okay? On the left-hand side, this is the stuff you're familiar with. Downward sloping demand curve, thousands if not millions of buyers. Upward sloping supply curve, right? Lots and lots of sellers. As if led by an invisible hand, the market forces of supply and demand, right? The rationing function of prices. Right now we have equilibrium price at $1, right? And this is in quantity is per pound, $1 per pound, and there's 100 pounds bought and sold. Now that could be per day, let's assume for now it's per day, okay? So let's think of it from the standpoint of both the buyers and the sellers. If you're a buyer of aluminum, right now you have to pay the $1 price. That's the market price. You have no control over price, but you'd be really anxious and happy if you could pay anything less than $1, right? So if you look at the extension of the demand curve on the right-hand side, right? You see that portion of the demand curve from $1 down? Buyers will say, man, I'll be happy to buy anything, any amount of aluminum at prices lower than $1, this quantities. Likewise for sellers, they're saying, wow, if the price, if I could sell it for above the market price of $1, I'd be happy and willing to sell more of it at a price above $1. So extending out the supply curve and the demand curve domestically gives us half of how the global price is set. What we also have to look at is Canada, our potential trading partner, right? So we look at equilibrium on the left-hand side. In Canada, the price per pound of aluminum is 75 cents. Currently 100 pounds being bought and sold every day. Same drill here, right? Canadian sellers will be happy taking anything greater than 75 cents. Canadian buyers, right, they will be happy paying anything less than 75 cents. So the extension of the supply in both of the markets represents the export supply. The extension of demand represents the import demand. If we bring these together, we can see, right, U.S. export supply, Canadian export supply, U.S. export demand, Canadian export demand. So if we look at the intersection of U.S. import demand and Canadian export supply, we have now determined the global price of a pound of aluminum based on the market forces of supply and demand, right? So notice that, and this should make sense to you, the global price falls somewhere between the equilibrium in the U.S. domestic market and equilibrium in the Canadian market, 88 cents per pound. Right? So that gives you some idea of how the forces of supply and demand ultimately determine the global prices of goods or services, imports and exports. Okay, foreign exchange market. Extremely important as far as the economic activity around the world, right? It's a competitive market. In other words, the value of a dollar and what a dollar is worth relative to other currencies is usually determined by the market forces of supply and demand. We will talk about the Chinese yuan and how that is a managed exchange rate. But generally speaking, the exchange rate between the dollar and other currencies are determined by free floating exchange rates. In other words, the market forces of supply and demand end up determining what a dollar is worth relative to the British pound, the euro, the yen, the Canadian dollar, the Brazilian real. Okay, so a couple ideas are important here. Number one is that appreciation and depreciation. You should get used to these terms. All right, sometimes called strengthening and weakening, or weakening and strengthening. All right, let's assume for a moment that $1 buys 90 euro cents. All right, so $100 buys 900 euros. That's today. Tomorrow, a dollar buys 91 euro cents, or $100 buys 91 euros. Right? So the dollar has appreciated or strengthened against the euro. Now, by default, this is a tit-for-tat relationship. If the dollar appreciated against the euro, just by definition, the euro has depreciated against the dollar. It's important to understand that idea. So, we've said this already, but get familiar with this term. All right, simple idea. Exchange rate, the price of one country's currency expressed in terms of another country's currency. So you see, like, $1 equals 0.9 euros, 0.90 euros. $1 equals 111 yen. So that's what we mean by the exchange rate. 1 equals 111 dollar-yen exchange rate. So now that we have defined what an exchange rate is, let's explain in general terms what causes exchange rates to change. In other words, what would cause the dollar to appreciate or depreciate against other currencies. Now remember, you could do the same analysis for, say, what would cause the euro to appreciate against the Brazilian real, what would cause the yen to appreciate against the Australian dollar or depreciate. So these principles apply to all market situations involving currency exchange rates. The first factor which determines exchange rates is the domestic real rate of interest, right? Domestic interest rates. So for instance, assume that the interest rate on a 10-year treasury, right, the principal means of financing our debt or deficits, right, debt issued by the federal government to finance the federal budget deficit. Assume that the interest rate on a 10-year treasury, U.S. treasury, is 3%, and interest on a 10-year Bund, which is the equivalent of a 10-year treasury but offered in Germany, is, say, 0.5%. Well, across the globe, investors who own German bonds will look to seek better yield. They want to find interest rates which are higher if they're going to lend their money for 10 years. So other things equal, ceteris paribus, right, higher interest rates in the United States would assume that would cause the dollar to appreciate against the euro. Right? If I owned €1,000,000 worth of German bonds and I was only receiving 0.5% interest on every bond I owned, I could sell those bonds, get euros, exchange those for dollars, and invest in U.S. government treasuries. But if I exchange my euros for dollars, I'm going to increase the demand for dollars, which will cause the value of the dollar to strengthen or appreciate. So domestic real interest rates. The second factor, domestic rate of inflation. Other things equal, right? Ceteris paribus. higher inflation is bad for a country's currency. Exchange rate, bad from the standpoint that it would usually cause it to appreciate, but you usually don't say good or bad. It's interesting because there's winners and losers caused or created when a dollar appreciates or decreases. Or, sorry, appreciates or depreciates. So, other things equal, if the U.S. inflation rate were higher than the euro, we would expect the dollar to depreciate relative to the euro and vice versa. Here's why, right? Think about some South American countries who have battled high rates of inflation and then they have actually stopped using their currencies. Investors are worried when interest rates start to get out of control. It's difficult to accurately predict where price levels are headed, and therefore a country's currency is no longer a valid medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value. For those reasons, investors look down upon those currencies, and typically those currencies will depreciate relative to other currencies. So think Venezuela, right? A South American country who had problems with high rates of inflation, right? Think Argentina. Right? Their currency suffered immensely in the currency exchange rate markets. All right, the next one, performance of the economy. Other things equal, if an economy's GDP strengthens, if economic output strengthens, we would assume the value of that currency would appreciate relative to other currencies. Now, of course, if all economies across the globe strengthen together, that might not be the case, but relative to other countries. So if the U.S. exhibits stronger economic growth than European nations, we would expect the dollar to appreciate against the euro. The last idea is simply speculation. There are traders who every day, all day, and these actually trade around the globe in different, the Forex market, currencies are trading 24/7 based on their assumed idea of where the dollar is headed in the next 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years. So if you think the dollar is going to strengthen over the next year relative to another country's currency based on these market factors, you could take a position to buy dollars relative to what they call it going long, buy dollars, or short the other country's currency and make money on the currency exchange fluctuation. So here's a picture of, using our force of supply and demand, how exchange rates are determined, right? This is the market for yen priced in dollars. One confusing aspect of supply and demand analysis that students sometimes find challenging is the idea that you're talking about the market for a currency priced in another currency's lingo, right? So this is the market for yen priced in dollars. So 1 yen equals 1 cent, which seems kind of odd, but in the real world, 1 yen equals roughly like, $1 equals roughly 100 yen, right? So market forces of supply and demand ultimately impact exchange rates. Those 4 factors we identified on the previous slide are going to be your non-price determinants, which end up shifting supply or demand for currencies and therefore causing the currency to appreciate or depreciate. The best way to learn about currency exchange rates is to look at some actual data from actual exchange rates. Let's do that now. So here is the U.S. rates table, U.S. dollar exchange rates table. As of the 24th of February, I try to get it as current as possible. February 24th, 2020, right? These exchange rates are in constant flux. So if you look up the exchange rate even during the time you're watching this video or a couple days from now, they will definitely be different. Unless some serious geopolitical event takes place, they will only be marginally different, but they will be a little different. So what is this telling us? Okay, think of it like this. This tells us how much of another currency $1 will buy. So $1 today buys 0.92 euros or 921. So in other words, if you took $100 and you went to Europe and you got a fair exchange rate today, you would get 92 euros and 15 euro cents, something really close to that, right? If you took $100 to Britain, in England, you would get 77 pounds. You would get $100 would get you 151 Australian dollars, 132 Canadian dollars, right? 97 Swiss francs, right? $100 will get you, right? Look at that, 1,100 yen. Right? So, it's interesting. It says like, wow, you might as well sell everything and move to Japan. But, that's just typical exchange rate there. Think of like $1 equals roughly 100 yen almost all the time. Right now the dollar has appreciated against the yen. And then the dollar buys 7.02 RMB or Chinese yuan. All right, more about the yuan later. It's an interesting situation with the yuan. The other exchange rates float. In other words, the exchange rate between the US dollar and all of the others on this list is determined by the market forces of supply and demand. Let's take a look closer at the dollar-euro exchange rate, and this is over the course of the last year, right? So you notice this is March of 2019 through almost end of February 2020. So this shows you what the dollar has done in terms of the exchange rate with the euro over that course of time. So first, ask yourself this question. Has the dollar strengthened or weakened against the euro? Has the dollar appreciated or depreciated against the euro? Well, the dollar has significantly appreciated against the euro, right? How much? Well, 0.86 back in, say, March of last year, all the way up to 0.92, right? So if we think of those in percentage terms, right, if we think about how much the dollar has appreciated against the euro over the course of the last year, right? That's what? From 86 to 92 is 6. So we take 6 divided by 86. It tells us that the dollar appreciated against the euro roughly 7% over the course of the last year. So then ask yourself another question. Who is hurt or helped by the 7% appreciation of the dollar relative to the euro? Now, before we answer that question, remember that if the dollar appreciated against the euro, by default, the euro must have depreciated against the dollar. This is an easy way to answer the question, who is hurt and who is helped. When would you have liked to travel to Europe? Assuming that the price of hotel stays and souvenirs, rental cars, accommodations didn't change over the course of the year, that the only thing that changed was the exchange rate. When was your dollar worth the most? Well, your dollar was worth the most just recently here in February. So if you think of it in these terms, if you had $100 back in March, you only got 86 euros. Now you get 92 euros. So that means you could buy 7% more goods and services on your trip to Europe. The dollar's appreciated against the euro. So if the dollar's appreciated against the euro, who else is hurt and who else is helped? Well, it's not going to make everybody better off. Donald Trump is not a big fan of a stronger US dollar. He's been griping about it. Why? Well, what if you're a company and you produce a good or provide a service and you export a great deal of what you sell and you export it to Europeans, right? Other things equal, a strengthening of the dollar makes US exports more expensive, roughly 7% more expensive. So an appreciating dollar is actually bad for US exports. Now, if you're a US company and you import, say, a resource from Europe, use a simple example. Assume you're a furniture maker, you make high-end, unique pieces, and you only use wood from the Verdun in Germany, okay? And it's, some special, immaculate, ornate lumber that creates spectacular looking furniture. Well, if you're buying European imports, the dollar's strength is to your advantage. The appreciation of the dollar makes European imports less expensive. So again, dollar appreciated against the euro this past year, roughly 7%. It created some winners and some losers. This is bad for U.S. exporters, good for U.S. importers. So if you're an American citizen who likes to purchase European goods, those imports are relatively less expensive. This is the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Chinese yuan or RMB. Big difference between the exchange rate between the dollar and all other currencies and the Chinese currency. China manages their exchange rates. In other words, China allows their currency to float within a band, but will not allow their currency to be completely determined by the market forces of supply and demand. Think about what's happened economically between China and the United States over the past 30 years and how those economic events should have affected the exchange rate between the two currencies. U.S. citizens continue to purchase far more imports from China than Chinese buy American exports. Think about how that is impacting the flow of currencies. Americans are sending billions and billions of dollars to China to buy Chinese products, right? And only a few Chinese RMB or yuan are flowing back in this direction. In theory, what should have happened to the dollar RMB yuan exchange rate? The Chinese currency should have appreciated significantly against the US dollar over the past 30 years, or the US dollar should have depreciated against the Chinese currency. Why? Because Chinese are receiving many dollars, right? And there has been very little natural forces to offset the flow of dollars into China, which means that much more significant demand for Chinese currency than American currency. So, you may have heard the term currency manipulator. Both the Democratic and Republican candidate for president and many members of the House and Senate have accused China of being a currency manipulator. What does that mean? Okay, how does China offset the natural forces of supply and demand? How does China keep the market forces from having their currency appreciate significantly against the dollar? China doesn't want a stronger yuan because it would make their exports far more expensive. China needs to figure out a way to buy dollars, dollar-denominated financial instruments, to offset the natural forces of market actions. China found an easy solution to their problem by purchasing U.S. government debt. China buys a whole slew of government-denominated debt. So every year the United States government runs a deficit. We finance our deficit by selling bonds, issuing debt. China buys a lot of U.S. bonds to the tune of approximately $1.7 trillion worth. Chinese government owns roughly $1.7 trillion worth of U.S. denominated debt. So there is what we mean by a currency manipulator, right? To offset what would have occurred to keep the yuan from seriously or significantly appreciating against the dollar and making Chinese exports far more expensive to Americans, China buys U.S. denominated debt. Now remember, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. First of all, it's like giving a tax cut to all Americans, right? Americans, the average Americans, are buying Chinese imports at seriously low prices. Second, right, you ever think about putting all of your eggs in one basket? China owns a lot of U.S. denominated debt. So if we were ever to have a military escalation with China, we could stop paying on that debt, and poor China would be out of luck, right? Plus, China is now intertwined with the health and success of the U.S. economy. Remember, they're being paid back in dollars. if the dollar were to depreciate, right, the value of the interest that China is receiving on the debt would drop. So China wants the U.S. to do well, because if the U.S. currency were to falter in international exchange markets, the return they receive on their investment in bonds would drop significantly, or could drop significantly. So it's an interesting, say, uncomfortable marriage between the U.S. and China when you look at their exchange rates and what has transpired over the last 30 years. Hope you've enjoyed this video on international trade and exchange rates. Good luck with your study of these subjects.